There are moments in a man's life that arrive without warning, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, tucked between the ordinary folds of a Tuesday night. No trumpets, no audience. Just a man, a rain-soaked street, and a choice that most people would never know he made. Marcus Johnson had lived 38 years without anyone handing him a miracle, and he had long since stopped expecting one. He worked the night shift at an auto repair shop on the edge of the city, drove a truck with a cracked dashboard, and ate most of his dinners alone at a kitchen table that was meant for four. He owed money to people he used to trust, and carried that weight the way some men carry old injuries quietly, without complaint, pretending on most days that it didn't slow him down. On the night, a designer wallet appeared at the edge of a dark parking lot, stuffed with more than $50,000 in cash. Not a single camera was pointed in his direction. Not one witness stood nearby. The rain was heavy enough to blur everything past 20 feet. Marcus was completely, utterly alone. And what he chose to do in that moment, what he refused to do, would set in motion a chain of events that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. Sometimes the most important decisions a man makes happen when no one is watching, and sometimes, without his knowing it, someone is watching after all. Marcus Johnson grew up in the kind of neighborhood where ambition was not discouraged so much as quietly exhausted by circumstance. His mother worked two jobs, a cleaning shift that started before dawn and a cashier position that ended after dark, and she did this without complaint for so many years that it became, in Marcus's childhood understanding, simply what strength looked like. His father was present enough to teach him how to fix things with his hands, and principled enough to tell him that a man's word was the only currency that couldn't be taken from him. He said it the way men of that generation said things worth saying, not often, not loudly, but with a weight that made sure you remembered it. Marcus absorbed both lessons early, and carried them the way you carry something that has been pressed into you before you were old enough to choose whether you wanted it. By the time he was in his 20s, he had built himself into something he was genuinely proud of: a certified automotive technician with a small but growing client base, a young wife named Denise, and a two-bedroom apartment that felt, for a few years, like the beginning of something real. He was good at his work in the specific, satisfying way that comes from understanding not just the mechanics of a thing, but the logic underneath it. Why an engine fails the way it fails. What a sound means before it becomes a problem. How to find the truth in a machine that is telling you something you need to hear. Then the company he worked for restructured, eliminating his department with the clean efficiency of a balance sheet that had no room for sentiment. A lawsuit from a client who claimed faulty repair work, a lawsuit Marcus always believed was fabricated, and which two separate mechanics who examined the vehicle later confirmed had no technical basis, drained his savings and scorched his professional reputation. The marriage, already strained by money, and by the particular silence that settles between two people when fear replaces hope, finally ended 3 years after the lawsuit. Denise moved across town. There were no children. There was only the debt, the apartment he could no longer afford alone, and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding from nothing. By 38, Marcus had moved into a modest rental in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. A small house with a patchy lawn, a porch that creaked in the right places, and neighbors who minded their own business and expected the same in return. He had learned, in the years since the divorce, how to live alone without being lonely in the way that breaks people, how to cook a decent meal for one, how to fill a Sunday afternoon with something that was not just the absence of company, how to take satisfaction in the small competencies of daily life. He worked the closing shift at Rennick's Auto, a repair shop owned by a gruff but fair man named Earl, who had hired Marcus, despite the lawsuit history, because he knew good mechanics were harder to find than good stories. Marcus also picked up odd jobs on weekends: oil changes for neighbors, brake work for the woman down the block, small electrical repairs for whoever needed them. He wasn't rebuilding an empire, he was just trying to keep the floor under his feet. What struck people who took the time to know him, which was not as many people as it should have been, was that Marcus carried none of this with bitterness. He was not a man who complained loudly or sought sympathy. He had a laugh that arrived slowly and meant something when it did. He kept his word without being asked twice. He helped people who couldn't pay him, not because he was unaware of his own financial situation, but because somewhere in his upbringing, the idea of walking past someone who needed help had never been given a comfortable place to live. He was, in the precise and old-fashioned sense of the phrase, a good man, the kind of good that is not announced, that does not require a stage or a witness, that simply shows up in the accumulated texture of ordinary days. His clothes were worn at the edges. His truck was old, and if you passed him on the street without knowing him, you might make the mistake, the very human, very common mistake, of assuming that a man who looked like he had very little to offer. That assumption would have been one of the more expensive errors of your life. The night it happened was a Wednesday in October, and the rain had been falling since early afternoon in the sullen, determined way that suggests it has no intention of stopping before morning. Marcus clocked out at Rennick's just past 11:30, pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, and walked the short distance to the parking lot behind the shop where his truck sat in its usual corner spot, under a light that had been flickering for weeks. He was thinking about nothing in particular, a list of things he needed from the grocery store, a noise in the truck's engine that he'd been meaning to diagnose when something on the ground caught his attention. It was near the edge of the lot, half hidden against the base of a concrete barrier, dark enough to be invisible to anyone not walking directly toward it. Marcus almost stepped over it. Instead, he crouched down and picked it up. It was a wallet. Thick, heavy, the kind of wallet made from leather so fine that it felt almost warm in his hand despite the cold. He turned it over. A designer logo embossed on the back, the kind he recognized from store windows he never entered. He straightened up and looked around. The lot was empty. The street beyond it was quiet, except for the rain and the distant sound of a car turning several blocks away. He opened it. The cash was bundled neatly, not loose, not scattered, but organized with the precision of someone who handled large sums regularly. Marcus counted it twice, partly from disbelief and partly from the same careful habit that made him a good mechanic. $52,400. He said the number quietly to himself, not loudly, because saying it loudly would have made it feel like something he was laying claim to, and he wasn't ready to think about it that way. Behind the cash were 3 credit cards, black and platinum, the colors that meant no limit worth discussing. There was a driver's license, a business card, slightly damp at the corner, and a folded document that looked like a signed contract, the kind of paper that belonged to a world Marcus had never moved through. He stood in the rain for a long moment, his jacket soaking through, the wallet in both hands. He thought about his debt. He thought about the number 3 years had added to it. He thought about what $52,000 could do for a man who had been doing the arithmetic of survival for longer than he cared to admit. He thought about all of this, the way a person examines something they know they are not going to take carefully, honestly, without flinching from the temptation, and then setting it down inside themselves. 2 of his coworkers were still in the shop when he walked back in, dry enough under the overhang to share a cigarette and an opinion. Marcus held up the wallet. The older one, a heavy-set man named Pete, who had worked at Rennick's for 14 years, let out a low whistle. The younger one, barely 22, and still at the stage of life where everything felt negotiable, said what Marcus had already anticipated someone would say, that the person who lost it was obviously rich, that rich people had insurance for things like this, that nobody would know, that nobody was looking. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, quietly, but without any drama, that he was going to find out who it belonged to and return it. Pete shrugged and said Marcus was a better man than him. The younger one laughed, not unkindly, and said he hoped Marcus at least kept the cash and returned the cards. Marcus didn't argue. He thanked them both, walked back out to his truck, and sat for a moment, with the wallet on the passenger seat and the rain drumming against the roof. Then he started the engine and drove home. The business card inside the wallet belonged to a company called Reynolds Capital Group. The name on the card, Victoria Reynolds, Chief Executive Officer, was printed in a clean, authoritative typeface that communicated without ambiguity that this was a person accustomed to being taken seriously. The address was in the financial district, the part of the city where the buildings had lobbies with marble floors and security desks, staffed by men in blazers who assessed visitors in the first 3 seconds and made decisions accordingly. Marcus called the number on the card the following morning, got through to an assistant after 2 transfers, and explained, briefly and without embellishment, that he had found a wallet he believed belonged to Miss Reynolds and would like to return it. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to be interesting. Then the assistant told him to come to the office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Marcus asked Earl for a few hours off, changed into the cleanest shirt. He owned a dark button-down with no visible wear at the collar, and drove to an address he had passed 100 times without ever having a reason to enter. The lobby of the Reynolds Capital Group building was exactly what Marcus had expected, and nothing he had prepared himself for. The ceiling was high enough to feel like a statement. The floors were the kind of polished stone that reflects everything above it with a cool, indifferent clarity. The security desk was manned by 2 men, both of whom looked up when Marcus walked in and held their gaze a beat longer than courtesy required. He stated his name. He said he had an appointment. The closer of the 2 men asked him to wait and made a phone call. And during the 30 seconds that the call lasted, Marcus stood with his hands at his sides and his expression unchanged, because he had spent enough of his life in rooms that questioned his right to be there to have developed a particular kind of stillness in response. He was not angry. He was simply present, patient, and entirely certain of why he was there. He was shown to an elevator. He was shown to a waiting area on the 14th floor. He was offered water by a young woman who seemed genuinely uncertain what to make of him, and he thanked her and declined. Victoria Reynolds walked into the room without announcement, and with the particular energy of someone who had been running at high speed all morning and had not yet found a reason to slow down. She was tall, precisely dressed in a charcoal blazer and tailored trousers, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless severity that took longer to achieve than it appeared. She was 42 years old and looked like someone who had decided at some point in her 30s that aging would simply have to accommodate her schedule. She assessed Marcus in approximately the same time it had taken the security guards downstairs, but where their assessment had been wary, hers was something closer to curious. She extended her hand. He shook it. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and held out the wallet. She took it, opened it, and went through it with the practiced efficiency of someone checking a known inventory. The cash, the cards, the document, the license. She closed it. She looked up at him. For a moment, just a moment, the brisk professional surface of her expression gave way to something unguarded and genuine. She said, quietly, that everything was there. He told her it was. She said she had assumed the cash would be gone. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. Then she asked him directly, with the bluntness of someone unaccustomed to softening things, "You really didn't take a single dollar?" Marcus looked at her without hesitation and said no. Victoria had been prepared to write a check. She had discussed it briefly with her assistant that morning, a reward, something generous, something that would close this out cleanly and let her get back to the 11 other things on her agenda before 3 o'clock. She named a figure. It was a number that would have meant a great deal to most people. Marcus shook his head. Victoria Reynolds had built a company from a 2-person consultancy into a mid-sized investment firm with over 40 employees and a client list that ran to several pages, and she had done it by understanding, with exceptional precision, what people wanted. She was not accustomed to being wrong about this. She named a higher figure. He shook his head again, and this time there was something almost gentle in the refusal, as if he understood that she was not being presumptuous, only operating by the logic of a world in which everything had a price, and the only question was whether the number was right. He told her that he hadn't returned the wallet to earn money. He said it the way a person states a simple fact, without pride, without performance. The way you might tell someone that water is cold, or that it is currently raining outside. Victoria studied him for a moment, with the careful attention of someone who has learned to distinguish between sincerity and its better rehearsed imitations. She had met a great many people in her professional life who said admirable things. She could count on one hand the ones whose actions had made those words feel like more than strategy. She opened her mouth to say something, and then stopped, which was unusual for her, because Victoria Reynolds almost always knew what she wanted to say. She told him that she found his position, She used the word position, the vocabulary of negotiation difficult to understand. He smiled, not unkindly, and said that it wasn't really a position. He said that a person's character didn't take the night off just because no one was watching. She didn't have an immediate answer for that. They were standing near the window of the conference room, the city gray and wet beyond the glass, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Marcus thanked her for her time, said he was glad the wallet had been returned safely, and told her to have a good afternoon. He was nearly at the door when she called after him, and asked with a casualness that was perhaps slightly too careful if he would mind leaving a contact number, in case she needed to follow up on anything. He wrote his cell number on the back of a small notepad she offered. She took it and looked at it briefly, then set it on the table as if she had merely been thorough, but she did not throw it away. For 3 days after the meeting, Victoria Reynolds sat with Marcus Johnson in the back of her mind, the way a song sits with you after you've heard it once present. Unhurried, resistant to dismissal. She reviewed the meeting twice, during moments she did not have available for such things. Once during a morning run on the treadmill in her building's gym, and once while a colleague across a conference table was explaining something about fourth-quarter projections that should have had her full attention. She was not a woman given to idle rumination. She had built her professional life on the practice of moving forward, of converting uncertainty into decision, of not lingering over things she could not quantify. Marcus Johnson resisted quantification in a way that she found, against her will, compelling. She asked her assistant, a meticulous young man named Daniel, who had worked for her for 4 years, and understood that requests of this nature occasionally arose and were not to be discussed, to pull together whatever basic information was publicly available. The results were unremarkable in the way that made them remarkable. No criminal record, no civil judgments beyond a dismissed lawsuit from several years prior, no social media presence worth noting, no affiliations with organizations that might suggest an ulterior motive. He worked at an auto repair shop. He lived in a small house in a working-class neighborhood. He had a few neighbors who, when asked in the vaguest possible terms, said that he was quiet and helpful and minded his own business. Daniel delivered this summary with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to editorialize. Victoria thanked him and dismissed him, and sat for a while with the summary on the desk in front of her without reading it again, because she had already memorized it the first time. What occupied her was not the information itself, but the absence of an explanation. She had returned to the question she had asked him in the conference room, why hadn't he taken the money? And she kept arriving at the same place. He had simply answered that it wasn't who he was. No complex reasoning, no moral argument, no appeal to consequences or rewards. Just a quiet statement of identity, offered as plainly as a name. Victoria had spent 20 years in a world where almost everyone had a price, and almost everyone was at least partially aware of it. She had navigated that world successfully, in part by being clear-eyed about it. The man she had met 3 days ago did not fit inside that framework, and the framework was something she had previously trusted completely. She decided she wanted to understand him. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that curiosity was not the only thing she was feeling, but she was not yet ready to examine what else was there. It was chance, she would tell herself later, though she knew that was only partly true. On Thursday afternoon, leaving a lunch meeting that had ended 40 minutes early, she was walking back toward her office building, along a street she did not usually take. She had chosen it on an impulse she did not fully examine when she saw him. Marcus was half a block ahead, walking in the same direction, his jacket, the dark green one he had worn to her office, his posture unhurried and self-contained. She slowed without deciding to. She told herself she was simply going the same way. An elderly woman on the sidewalk ahead of Marcus was struggling with 2 large canvas bags that were clearly too heavy for her, and without breaking stride or looking around to see who might be watching, Marcus stopped, said something to the woman, took both bags, and walked with her to her building at the end of the block. Victoria watched him set the bags down inside the lobby door. She watched him exchange a few words with the woman, who seemed to be thanking him at some length. She watched him smile, say something brief, and leave. She followed at a distance she told herself was incidental. 4 blocks later, On a corner where a man sat bundled against the cold with a cardboard sign beside him, Marcus stopped again. He reached into his jacket, not with the hurried, guilty gesture of someone performing charity under observation, but with the same natural ease he had shown in carrying the old woman's bags. He crouched down, actually crouched, level with the man on the ground, and handed him something and spoke to him for a full 2 minutes. Victoria stopped on the opposite side of the street and pretended to look at her phone. The conversation between Marcus and the man on the corner had the quality of two people who were simply talking, without the carefully maintained distance that most people kept when performing acts of generosity towards strangers. When Marcus stood and walked on, the man on the corner watched him go with an expression that Victoria found unexpectedly difficult to look at directly. 3 blocks further, a young woman was crouched over a bicycle with a chain that had come loose, her frustration visible from across the street. Marcus noticed her. He crossed over. He spent perhaps 8 minutes fixing the chain with his bare hands in the cold, refusing the woman's offered payment with a small shake of his head, and then he walked on. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. He did not walk differently, or carry himself with the slight elevation that people sometimes acquire after performing a visible act of kindness. He simply continued, at the same pace, in the same direction, as if what he had just done was simply what the moment had asked of him, and he had answered without making anything of it. Victoria followed him to a street she did not know, in a neighborhood she rarely entered, and stopped on the sidewalk outside a small house with a light on in the front window. She stood there for a long moment in the early dark, her hands in her coat pockets, aware that she had just done something that required explanation not to Marcus, not yet, but to herself. What she had been watching for the past 40 minutes was not a performance. She was certain of this, with the same certainty she brought to decisions that mattered. What she had been watching was simply a man, moving through his evening, being exactly who he was. She rang the doorbell before she could decide not to. The porch light came on. The door opened. Marcus Johnson stood in the doorway in a plain gray sweatshirt and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something that might have been, if she was reading it correctly, a quiet kind of amusement. She said, "Good evening." He said, "Good evening." He asked if she was all right. She said yes, and then, because Victoria Reynolds had not reached her position in life by being unable to manage uncomfortable moments, she told him directly that she had seen him on the street and had followed him, and that she understood this was an unusual thing to do, and that she owed him an explanation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door wider and asked if she wanted to come in. She did. The inside of the house was small, in the way that small things sometimes are not cramped, but honest, containing only what was necessary and what was cared for. The furniture was old, but maintained. A shelf of tools on the wall near the kitchen, organized with the precision of a man who used them regularly. A few books on a low shelf, a table with 2 chairs and a coffee mug that had been recently washed. There were no pretensions in this space, no objects chosen to impress, no arrangement of things designed to communicate anything other than the fact that someone lived here who took care of what he owned. Victoria, who had designed her own apartment to within an inch of its life, every object selected, every surface intentional, found herself oddly moved by the absence of that kind of effort. She sat in one of the chairs at the table. He made coffee without asking if she wanted it, which was, she realized, exactly the right thing to do. They talked for a long time. He told her about his life without apology and without performance, about the job he had lost, about the lawsuit that had damaged him, about the marriage that had ended not with violence or betrayal, but with the quieter defeat of 2 people who had wanted different things from a future that wouldn't accommodate both versions. He talked about the debt the way a person talks about weather, as a condition of the environment, uncomfortable, managed, endured. He said that he had come to understand, somewhere in his late 30s, that the things most worth keeping could not be taken from him by financial reversal or professional failure, or the judgment of people who did not know him well enough to judge fairly. He said that he had lost a lot of things. He had not lost his sense of who he was. Victoria listened to this with the attention of someone hearing something they had needed to hear for longer than they had realized. She had her own losses, she told him. She had built a company that was, by every metric she had ever cared about, a success. She had a beautiful apartment, a driver, a table at every restaurant she wanted, and a calendar so full that she sometimes could not remember the last time she had sat at a table without an agenda. She told him that she was lonely in the specific way that successful people are sometimes lonely, surrounded by people who want things from them, uncertain whether any of them simply want them. She had not said this aloud to anyone in years, possibly ever. She said it to Marcus Johnson at a small kitchen table on a rainy Thursday night in October, and when it came out, it did not feel like vulnerability. It felt like relief. The meetings that followed were not planned with the precision that Victoria usually applied to her schedule. They happened with the organic, slightly bewildering frequency of two people who have discovered that time in each other's company is not something either of them has any immediate interest in limiting. They met for coffee on a Sunday morning at a place Marcus suggested, a small cafe 3 blocks from his house, run by a retired couple who knew him by name and refilled his cup without being asked. They walked along the river on a Tuesday evening after she left work earlier than she had in months, neither of them saying much at first, then both of them talking at once about entirely different things and laughing at the collision. They talked about music and about cities they had and had not visited. They talked about the things they regretted and the things they had, against the odds, managed to get right. Victoria noticed that Marcus listened to her the way very few people did, not waiting for his turn, not cataloging what she said for later use, but simply receiving it, giving it the weight it deserved, and responding to what she had actually said rather than to the version of it that was most convenient. She could not fully articulate how rare this was. She only knew that after an evening spent in his company, she felt, reliably, more like herself than she had felt in a very long time. Marcus, for his part, was careful. Not cold, not distant, but careful, the way a man is careful with something he has reason to believe might be important. He did not pretend that the difference in their circumstances was invisible, because pretending things were invisible was not a habit he had ever cultivated. He acknowledged it, once, on a walk when she had mentioned offhandedly where she was going for the holidays, and a beat of quiet had fallen between them, that held the weight of two very different financial realities. He said that he didn't think money changed what people were fundamentally, but that he also didn't think pretending it wasn't there was the same as not caring about it. She told him, she agreed. She said she had been raised to believe that what a person had was the measure of what they were worth, and that building her company had, in some ways, been an attempt to disprove that to herself as much as to anyone else. He nodded slowly and said that made a particular kind of sense. In the company, people talked. Of course they talked, organizations always do, and an organization run by a woman who was now occasionally seen at lunch with a man who drove a repair truck and wore work jackets was an organization that had material for conversation. Daniel, her assistant, was professionally neutral about all of it. A few of her senior staff were less so, though they expressed their opinions with the careful indirection of people who understood the hierarchy. Victoria was aware of it all. She was aware of it, and she continued exactly as she had been, because she had not built what she had built by adjusting her decisions to match other people's comfort. The board's reaction was not a surprise. 3 of her 7 directors had the kind of opinions about personal associations that were rooted in an older and more stratified understanding of how the world worked, and they expressed those opinions through the medium of concerns about optics and questions about judgment that were legible to everyone in the room for what they actually were. A formal objection was raised at a quarterly meeting, not about Marcus specifically, never quite directly, but about the advisability of certain public associations for a company at their stage of growth, framed with enough corporate language to maintain a thin veneer of plausibility. There was a suggestion, delivered with elaborate casualness by one of the senior investors, that the story of how Marcus and Victoria had originally met had a quality that could be leveraged against the company, that the optics of a CEO developing a personal relationship with someone who had returned $50,000 in cash might raise questions, depending on how it was framed by people inclined to frame things badly. Victoria listened to all of this with the particular stillness of someone who is deciding something while appearing to consider it. Marcus learned about the board's position through a conversation with Daniel, who had taken the unusual step of calling him directly in action that surprised Marcus and that he would not learn until much later had been a significant departure from Daniel's professional norms, made because Daniel had worked for Victoria Reynolds for 4 years and knew, with the particular clarity of long observation, what she was actually like beneath the executive surface, and did not want to see her lose something she needed because of a silence that could be broken. It was, Marcus would think afterward, a quietly courageous thing for Daniel to have done. Marcus sat with the information for 2 days. He turned it over the way. He turned over a diagnostic problem, looking for the part of it that was actually the problem, distinguishing it from the parts that were only symptoms. He slept on it the first night and got nowhere. The second night, he sat on his porch in the cold for a long time, watching the street, and by the time he came back inside, he understood what he needed to do. On the third day, he called Victoria and asked to meet her. He told her, directly, that he was aware of what was happening at the board level. He told her that he had no intention of being a liability to something she had spent 20 years building, not to her reputation, not to her board, not to the people whose livelihoods depended on the company continuing to function at the level she had built it to. He was entirely calm when he said this. He said that he thought she was extraordinary, and that he had meant everything he had ever said to her, and that precisely because those things were true, he was not willing to let his presence cost her something she could not afford to lose. He was calm, he was clear, his voice was steady throughout. Victoria, listening to him, felt something happen in her chest that she could not quite name but recognized. In the way that you recognize music you have not heard in a very long time, something important, arriving. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said his name. Then she said, very quietly, that she had not come this far by letting other people decide what she could afford to lose. She said goodbye, told him she would call him tomorrow, and asked him not to make any decisions before she did. Then she ended the call and sat at her desk in her office on the 14th floor for 14 unscheduled minutes, which was more unscheduled stillness than Victoria Reynolds had permitted herself in years. And then she called Daniel and told him to schedule an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. The meeting was full. 7 directors, 4 senior investors, 2 legal advisors, and Victoria Reynolds at the head of the table, dressed in a way that communicated without any ambiguity that she had not arrived to be managed. She opened, without preamble. She said that she was aware of the concerns that had been raised, and that she wanted to address them directly, because she had always preferred directness to the other available options. She said that she was going to tell them a story, and that she would appreciate their patience for approximately 5 minutes. She told them about the wallet. She told it straight. The rain, the parking lot, the $52,000 in cash, the designer cards, the contract, all of it. She told them about calling Marcus in, about watching him return every dollar without hesitation, about offering him a reward that he declined not once, but twice. She told them about following him through the city and watching him help an elderly woman carry her groceries and sit with a homeless man and fix a stranger's bicycle in the cold without expecting or receiving anything in return. She told them about the kitchen table and the conversation that had lasted until midnight. She paused here and let the room hold what she had given it. And then she said, without raising her voice, that she had been in business for 20 years, that she had sat across tables from senators and fund managers and people who referred to their own ethical standards in the third person, and that the man she had just described to them, who worked a late shift at a repair shop, who fixed bicycles for strangers in the rain, who returned $52,000 because it was the right thing to do, was the most honest person she had met in all of that time. She told them that she was not asking for their approval of her personal life. What she was asking, and she said this with the quiet force of someone who has identified the precise point they want to make and intends to make it, was that they consider whether the man she was describing was more or less likely to exercise sound judgment than the people in that room who were suggesting he was a threat to the company's image. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be meaningful. One of the senior investors cleared his throat. Another director, a woman in her mid-60s who had known Victoria since the early days of the company, nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Victoria said that she understood they had fiduciary responsibilities and that she took those responsibilities seriously and always had. She said that she also had a responsibility to herself, which she had been neglecting for a long time, and that she intended to stop neglecting it, she said. And she did not look away from the room when she said it. The most honest man I have ever met does not have a seat at this table. That should tell all of us something worth sitting with for a while. She closed her folder. She thanked them for their time. She walked out of the room and took the elevator down to the lobby and out through the glass doors onto the street, where Marcus Johnson was waiting on the steps because she had called him that morning and asked him to come, and he had come because that was the kind of man he was. She stood in front of him for a moment without speaking. He looked at her steadily, with the expression she had come to recognize, attentive, patient, entirely present. She said that she owed him an apology. He asked, what for? She said that she had spent a week treating the possibility of them as a problem to be solved rather than a thing worth protecting, and that she was done doing that. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that she didn't owe him an apology. She said she knew he would say that. He almost smiled. She told him that on the day she had followed him through the city, she had stood outside his house on the sidewalk and understood something that she had been working around for several weeks without allowing herself to look at it directly, that she had not felt like herself in years, and that in his company she did. He looked at her for a long moment. He said that she had always been herself, as far as he could tell. She said that was possibly the nicest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. He said that it was the truth, which was all it was. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not with the weight of anything being declared, just quietly and with intention. The way you reach for something you are not willing to leave on the table. He held it. The city moved around them, indifferent and busy, the way cities always are, and neither of them said anything for a moment because some things don't need words to be understood. What Marcus Johnson had done on that rainy Wednesday night in October was, by the most transactional measure, nothing remarkable. He had found something that wasn't his and returned it to the person it belonged to. He had declined to profit from a moment of someone else's misfortune. He had done this in the dark, in the rain, with no audience and no reward, and no expectation of either. What it cost him, in the immediate sense, was nothing but the effort. What it set in motion, the conversation in the conference room, the walk through the city, the kitchen table at midnight, the board meeting, the steps outside the lobby, none of that could have been predicted from the outside. Very little of what matters most in a life can be predicted from the outside. Marcus had not returned the wallet hoping for a transformation. He had returned it because it was the right thing to do, and he was a man who did right things, not because he expected the world to notice, but because he had decided, at some point, that he could not precisely identify that his integrity was not something he was willing to compromise for any sum of money, and that this decision required no particular courage because it was not actually a difficult decision for him. It had simply become, over years of quiet living, the only way he knew how to be. Victoria Reynolds was, by most measures, a person who had everything. She had arrived at 42 with the company, the apartment, the reputation, the respect of her industry, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has achieved everything they set out to achieve, and found that achievement, alone, does not keep you warm. She had not known she was looking for anything. She would tell you later, in the careful, self-aware way she had begun to speak about her own interior life, that she had not thought she was missing anything, because she had been moving too quickly to notice the absence. A wallet left in a parking lot and returned intact by a man who asked for nothing had slowed her down enough to notice. What she found when she slowed down was, among other things, herself. Both of them had lost things, Marcus to circumstance and bad luck and the quiet weight of an unjust world, Victoria to choices, freely made, and speed, maintained at the expense of stillness. Neither of them was, by the time they stood on those steps outside the lobby with their hands clasped, entirely what they had been at the beginning of October. That is usually how it works. When two people find each other in the way that they found each other, not looking, not ready, not expecting, just present in the same moment, both of them honest enough to see what was there. They did not move in together immediately, or make public announcements, or arrange their relationship to fit anyone else's narrative. They moved at the pace that felt right to them, which was deliberate and unhurried, and occasionally accompanied by the small, surprised laughter of two people who keep discovering that the other one understands something they had assumed no one else would understand. Daniel adjusted his scheduling protocols to accommodate certain recurring commitments on Victoria's calendar without comment, as he had always adjusted to whatever was required. Earl at Rennick's Auto noticed that Marcus seemed to be in a marginally better mood on Monday mornings and concluded, correctly, that something had changed, and asked no questions, because Marcus was the kind of man you respected enough not to push. The board of Reynolds Capital Group continued its work with the pragmatic adaptability of a body that understood on some functional level that the woman at its head was going to do what she decided to do, and that the available options were to be useful or to be replaced. Most of them chose to be useful. The senior investor who had delivered the original suggestion about optics did not raise the subject again. The director who had nodded once at Victoria's speech began, in the weeks that followed, to speak slightly more plainly in meetings, as if some small permission had been extended and she had decided to take it. There is a version of this story that is about a wallet and a reward and a romantic plot that could be summarized in a few sentences. There is another version, which is the true one, that is about a man who had been reduced by circumstance and misjudged by strangers, and who had held on to himself anyway, who had kept, through everything, the part of him that knew what was right and did it without needing an audience. It is about a woman who had built a fortress of success around a loneliness she had not fully acknowledged and who was undone, gently and completely, by the sight of a man carrying a stranger's groceries in the rain. It is about what happens when two people who have learned, in different ways and different worlds, that integrity is not something you practice only when it is convenient. What happens when those two people recognize each other? It is about the specific, undervalued power of being exactly who you are when it costs you something to be it, and the way that power tends to be seen, eventually, by the people who matter. Marcus had never performed his decency for an audience. He had lived it in the accumulation of small, unwitnessed moments. The groceries, the conversation on the corner, the bicycle chain, the wallet on the wet asphalt, none of which he had assigned any particular significance to, because to him they were not significant. They were simply what the moment required. That quiet consistency, that complete absence of performance, was the thing that had undone Victoria more completely than any deliberate act of charm could have managed. You cannot manufacture the effect of a person who simply is what they are. You can recognize it, though, and if you are paying attention, you can choose not to walk away from it. The greatest measure of a person is not found in what they carry. It is not found in what they have accumulated or what others believe them to possess. It is found in what they refuse to take when taking would be easy, when no one is watching, when the need is real and the opportunity is there, and the only thing standing between them and the easier choice is who they have decided to be. Marcus Johnson knew who he had decided to be. He had known it long before a wallet appeared in the rain on a Wednesday night in October. He simply held on to it. The way you hold on to the things that matter, quietly and without fanfare, because they are worth holding on to, regardless of whether the world is paying attention. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the world is paying attention after all. Sometimes the thing you did when no one was watching is the very thing that changes everything. And sometimes the life you have been quietly, patiently building in the dark turns out to be exactly the one you were always meant to be living. Marcus Johnson did not know any of this when he bent down beside a concrete barrier in a rainy parking lot and picked up a wallet that was not his. He only knew what his father had told him, years ago, in the plain and unhurried way of a man who said things that were worth remembering, that a man's word and his character, and his choices, when no one was there to grade them, was the only currency that could not be taken. Everything else, it turned out, was just interest.